Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cluster API office hours meeting. Cluster API is a project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We have meeting etiquette, so use your raise hand features. You can find it under the participant list of Zoom. If you have any topics, feel free to add them to the agenda document. If you don't have access to this document, join the SIG Cluster Lifecycle mailing list, and you should get access soonish. I'll post the link to the meeting notes in chat. So if you want to add anything, definitely add your name to the attending list if you want to. And let's start. Does anybody want to say hi or introduce themselves before we start with the PSAs? See a few new names. Well, if this is your first time, definitely welcome. And let's get started. So I have the first PSA. We have a 039 release. I wrote soonish because there is like still 11 open things here. There's a lot of in-flight PRs. We were planning to kind of get it like by I think August 31st or by finish like at the end of this week. But if we cannot get all of them in either, if we want to still release, we can punt some of these out to 0310 or we can delay the release. If you have anything for that it's in here that's assigned to you, definitely feel free to kind of comment on it. Like if you can get it finished, we can move the milestone. I don't think anything in here is like necessarily blocking, but yeah, let's try to get them in sooner rather than later. Um, any questions on the release? And just as a reminder, 039 is going to be probably, we're going to have 0310 as the last release for 03, and then start working on 04. If you have anything for Alpha 4 that you would like to propose, definitely feel free to open an RFE issue. We'll start the proposal process in probably like the next couple of weeks and start working, like all together on proposals. And we'll definitely like have more 03 releases if bugs come in that have to be backordered. That should definitely be the exception and not the rule. Cecile, Andy, do you want to add anything else on the 0304?
Yeah, thanks, Vince. Or you can go ahead, Cecile.
No, I'm good. Go ahead.
So I was going to say, I think it's probably worth mentioning that we probably wouldn't be backporting any features to 0.3 if you didn't already cover that, Vince, that if we're going to be adding new features, they'll go in the main branch for 0.4, and bug fixes and security fixes can go and be backported.
Cecile, did you want to add anything else before we move? All right. All right, Fabrizio, you have another PSA here. Go for it.
Yeah, thank you. So I started to work on condition for the delayed workflow. I'm working on CAPI, CAPD, and CAPV. The idea is really simple. So if we have a condition, say when provisioned, when the deletion starts, this condition basically switched from true to false, and the reason is deleting, and this goes throughout the chain. And so I would like to make everyone aware that this work is started, and if all the provider can keep up, it would be nice.
So I think you mentioned that like at this particular PR, like we might want to wait for 0310. Is there any reason that we cannot merge it now, like in terms of, you mentioned something about user experience. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so basically how it works now is that condition, the condition, especially the warning like deleting, bubble ups through the chain. And basically, if we are implementing these, but the provider are not ready, we will get, for instance, a clustering deleting, but the machine will still be ready. And this might result confusing to the user. So in my opinion, there should be a kind of coordination between CAPI and the provider. It is not blocking, but it is also not nice. This is at least my idea around this.
Got it. So maybe given that infrastructure providers will need to adopt this, maybe this should go in 039 so that they can release a new version based on 039. To see what you think. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think we should get, if we can get it earlier rather than later, so we have time before V1 Alpha 4 to get that in from the infrastructure side, that'd be great. Yeah.
Okay, the PR is ready. So
Awesome. I'll take another look at this later, and
yeah,
yes.
there are few needs to get addressed from the last review, but I think we are good.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other PSA before we move to discussion topics? All right, let's move on. Windows support for CAPI, exciting.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kalia. I'm from Microsoft. If you've ever worked in the Windows space or the CubeADM for Windows space, you might have seen some of my work. But James and I paired to create this proposal, which will eventually turn into a proper CAPE, I think is how it's pronounced. But I think the first step is putting it in a Google Doc so that we can all comment on it. I don't know what the format is. Do I go through the whole thing or do I just give like a brief overview of our plans?
We should probably give a brief overview and introduce the problem. But yeah, like starting with the Google Doc, it's usually what we do, and then we'll probably move to a PR later.
Cool. Okay, so basically the crux of the problem here is that to get Windows support for cluster API, we're a bit limited because we don't have privileged containers in Windows as of yet. But in the past couple weeks, actually, there has been a proposal for privileged containers for Windows. So that's being worked on concurrently with this. Due to the timing, we think that we'll be able to get an alpha implementation of Windows in CAPI before then. So as a stopgap, we're going to use a product that was developed by Ben Moss at Rancher. It's called Wins. And basically what it does is it proxies commands from a container through a named pipe so that those commands can be run on the host itself. So it's this proxying model has been used in a few different scenarios to model privileged containers. So basically our plan is to use Wins in alpha, and our implementation is also going to be using Cloudbase in it, which is a product by Cloudbase. And we do have a few prototypes using Cloudbase in it, showing that we can get Windows nodes to join the CAPZ cluster. And I think also we've had success with Cluster API Amazon. Ben Moss had a prototype for that. So we're just going to build upon those prototypes and create a solution. And our goal really with this proposal is to create a solution that will be extensible for all of the infrastructure providers. And so that includes creating a set of scripts so that providers can set up their own VHDs. And that's pretty much it. The rest of the details are in the document. So if you guys would like to take a look through it and add your comments, I'll be reviewing it throughout the week. James is out of office this week, but he'll be back too soon. But he and I co-authored this together. So, yeah.
And I guess to add a couple more things, first of all, what we're asking from SIG cluster lifecycle is a few things. You know, we're looking for you, a team, to review this document, provide us feedback, but also to take along this journey with us. You know, as part of this work, a big component of this is reviews, architectural guidance, and, you know, getting PRs merged. And we know that that's a significant investment from any SIG in Kubernetes. So what we're looking for is also to budget some of your time for the 120 timeframe to dedicate to this, even though it's not, you may not have to write code, it's significant time for PR reviews and other activities. So Vince, what do you think it's the next step for something like this? How should we proceed?
Probably as usual. We can send the document to the SIG cluster lifecycle mailing list to get more attention. If anybody here has experience with Windows, definitely look at the proposal. I'll take a look from a cluster API point of view. I don't have much experience with Windows directly, but yeah, if anything pops up, like, we'll definitely comment on the document. Then we'll wait for comments, and then oh, thanks, Cecile. James already sent it to the mailing list last week. That's perfect. Wait for comments, and then we'll transform it to a PR for Cluster API. And I guess depending on if there is breaking changes that need to be made, but I don't think so. I think this can probably be adapted, right? So,
yeah, there are no breaking changes, particularly for the alpha stage.
Perfect.
And I see Ben that he just came online, but, you know, Ben is part of the Cluster API team, so we'd love for him to get, you know, to spend some time on this as well with James and Kali and the team.
Any other comments before we move on? Going once, twice. All right, Fabrizio Capi in GitOps.
Thank you. So I would like to start a group discussion around this topic, Capi and GitOps, because yeah, it was one topic that popped out in the question at KubeCon after the Capi talks, and it is also a refi that we have in the queue for V1 Alpha 4, and so what is my take around this topic? My take is that as of today, Cluster API can be fairly operated in a GitOps model very well for what regards the workload cluster, but this is not so true for what regards the management cluster, because for the management cluster we have a ClusterCuttle, which is an imperative tool. So given this background, I would like to start and to hear the people idea about people opinion about the idea of ClusterCuttle operator, and my view on this operator is that basically we should introduce a new abstraction which is the provider or the provider instance in a management cluster, and use the operator, the ClusterCuttle operator, leveraging on the ClusterCuttle library in order to make possible to install and manage all the provider in a fully declarative approach. So this is yeah, this is something that I'm starting to think about. I had also some discussion with Warren, and which managed today most of the work on ClusterCuttle. So now I would like to, if possible, to hear some other opinions with regard to this topic.
Brian, go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm Brian Borum. I work for Weaveworks. My boss invented the word GitOps. And so we do a lot of CAPI, a lot of installing of clusters using GitOps, and completely ignore ClusterCuttle because it just doesn't fit the model. So I'm interested in what you might come up with. Yeah, we kind of, I guess we just do pragmatic things, bend the rules, you might say. And there's a bunch of my colleagues that we should pull into this discussion, like Richard Case, for instance. Yeah.
Ben, go ahead.
I think it's confusing to me that we're talking about it as a cluster cuddle operator. It seems like it's a, also to the extent that I understand it, which maybe is limited, it seems like it's about sharing certain configuration of your clusters among, so that like instead of them being files on your local file system, which are like the cluster cuddle config files, they're more like stored in the CRDs. But it's, I think what's weird is just like cluster cuddle is the CLI for driving CAPI, and now we're making an operator for driving cluster cuddle. Like it's like, yeah, then we'll have like a CLI for installing the operator, and then we'll have an operator for installing the CLI. Yeah.
No,
I guess
maybe the name could create confusion, but I think that I got the point, and I like your point, because one of the other limitations that I saw today in ClusterCuttle is that basically the settings are local, and this makes ClusterCuttle hard to be operated by a team. So if we can somehow move the settings into the cluster, this will make ClusterCuttle more easy to be operated on a team, and also less error prone. If you think as today you have to set the variable when you're doing it, and then remember all the exact variable to when you do upgrade. So yeah, I don't know if the name is the right name, but I think that the problem of config, how they lives, is in the scope of this discussion.
So I know Jack and Andrew have their hand here raised. I just wanted to take a step back from here. Like, we're talking about an operator to manage cluster API, not an operator to manage cluster cuddle directly. Apart from the GitHub point of use case, there's other problems that we probably want to solve with an operator like the CLI today. It's version, but its own APIs are not. Like, there's not a declarative API that we can then convert between one alpha and another. Other than that, like, it's really hard to like propagate changes. We have had multiple PRs that went into ClusterCuttle, for example, that like to support one little change for the move or changing a spec or support a new feature. This applied to like a bunch of different things because there isn't the right abstraction. So this is kind of like an effort to create that abstraction first. Jack?
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask a question to Brian about your GitOps usage of Cluster API, not using ClusterCuttle. Does that imply that you're using the equivalent Cluster API SDK, or basically you're using the libraries directly in your tooling and not using the CLI?
Yeah, or, I mean, you know, there's 1,000 flowers have bloomed. We have people who have tried to do the whole thing with Helm charts. Yeah, we could talk for days.
I mean, I guess, did you like reverse engineer the way that ClusterCuttle provides cluster configuration generation? Are you doing that YAML transformations on your own?
Not much, no. No, I mean, we started with CAPI V1 Alpha 1 like 2 years ago or more, and did things that, like I say, kind of pragmatic things, brought stuff up, wrote programs, wrote scripts, wrote tools, most of which is open source, but some isn't. And I mean, part of why I'm kind of hedging, like I'm not coming straight out and saying this is the one way to do it, because all of it has issues. Like that's why I say we can talk about it, but I don't have like the answer. Sorry, I don't know if I'm helping to answer your question.
Yeah, cool. No, I think I'm mostly curious about the extent to which Cluster Cuddle is simply a CLI on top of sort of strongly versioned APIs. And if Cluster Cuddle delivers functionality that doesn't really exist as an API underneath the hood, then that's probably
like the pivot thing is an example. That I don't think that exists outside of Cluster Cuddle in any of the operators or controllers or whatever. And it happened that it didn't, that specific implementation of pivot at the time, we built something that's kind of logically equivalent, but actually works completely differently in our thing called WKS CTL. So, that's an example. We in that case we didn't use the library. We take the API as a standard, and we take the spirit of declarative config as a like an iron rule, but then we get creative.
Cool, thanks. I hope that digression was useful to other folks. I'll be quiet now.
Andrew?
Hi. So a few things. The first thing is that we at New Relic are huge consumers of Cluster Cuddle Move, which is Pivot v2 effectively. And we have a strong desire to not have to call Cluster Cuddle Move in like a script. We would prefer the ability to shift at will via cluster configuration. And this has to do with the way that we orchestrate, let's say, environment teardown or environment stand up. We have some use cases where, like clusters that we pivot, we want to temporarily pivot back, things like that. And so Cluster Cuddle Move is one thing we would definitely be interested in more of a declarative solution for. The other thing is flavors. Cluster Cuddle has the concept of flavors, and we have worked around the flavors idea with operators in our environment. So for example, we have let's say many AWS accounts, and we know for a fact that the VPC for every or let's say this, we know the subnets that we want to use for any machine, but we have development teams that can create their own machine objects. Well, we have to basically put a defaulting webhook in place that says, hey, you're in this AWS account in this VPC, you have to use one of these subnets. And we could use flavors as a way to kind of say, hey, the flavor for this AWS account is this, default to this, and anything else you provide will override. So that's kind of the angle from which an operator for Cluster Cuddle or management could be potentially useful.
Thanks, Andrew. Fabrizio, any other comment on that?
No, thank you for the comment. From what I get, I think that maybe we should start a kind of working group or a shared document and try to iterate and shape out goals, non-goals for this idea, around this idea.
Awesome, yeah. Let's get started on a working group for this, because given that this is probably one of the best things that we could do to manage Cluster API in an easier way and a more version way as well. It doesn't mean that we have to tackle everything at once. As soon as we get like a more of the idea of what we want to solve, then we can split up into maybe multiple alphas and, take a more iterative approach. Thanks. Any other last minute comment on the CAPI and GitOps? I think there is a lot of +1 to call this management cluster operator. Thanks, Jason, to suggest that. Cool. Let's move on. Cluster cuddle rollout proposal.
Hello. I just put together this proposal recently. Just wanted to ask folks to take a quick look at the Google Doc. A very quick summary would be that initially we had a use case at AT&T where we wanted to basically issue rollouts of control plane nodes of our worker nodes. It's possible today with KCP to force a rollout using this update at attribute. It's not possible with machine deployments to do that. So that's where sort of things got started. Then Jason mentioned that it would be nice if we supported something like a kubectl rollout command. So that kind of broadened the scope of the things that were possible. And that's sort of where this doc ends up, is that I tried to look very carefully at how kubectl rollout works, and with the long-term goal being that we would have kubectl rollout support. But a short-term method here that's proposed here is to have a subcommand or have a command for clusterctl that's called rollout. I'm not going to go through every one of these, but I think some of the stuff is already there. There's a lot of things that could be done today. There are some additional small tasks, maybe low-hanging fruits, you could call them, that we could do to have additional support for what that's required for these commands, these subcommands rather. Then there are maybe some slightly bigger items that I don't really discuss here. Would definitely requires, I think, some deeper discussion with the core members. For example, the machine deployment, machine set model fits really well with the kubectl rollout command, in the sense that you have your pod deployments and you have your replica sets. And that machine set, machine deployment model fits really well there. Unfortunately, the same model doesn't fit so well with the control plane, the kubeadm control plane. So that would be like a big ticket item that's not really discussed here, but something for people to think about as well. But overall, yeah, please let me know. That's all I really have to say. If you have any feedback, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks, Arvin. Is there any thoughts, questions, concerns on clusterctl rollout? Going once. Warren, Fabrizio, you folks worked on clusterctl. Do you have any thoughts? Kind of call out.
Not with regard to clusterctl strictly, because as it was explained, putting this command in clusterctl is just a temporary solution, while we make it possible in via the kubectl. My initial take is that if it makes sense to tackle at the same time the control plane and the machine deployment, or to split the activities into steps. So this is only my hot takes to the document.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so this document, sorry.
Go ahead.
This document only addresses machine deployment, at this point. It doesn't address the kubeadm control plane. I think that's a bigger task. Probably we could try to incorporate it here, or maybe as a follow-up.
I'm fine taking step by step.
Cecile?
Sorry. Yeah, I need to go through the doc, but I guess my initial question is, it seems to me like cluster kettle is more meant to, manage the management cluster and the cluster API like installation and all of that. And we've never really crossed that line of managing like the workload clusters themselves, as in like doing day 2 operations on the workload clusters from cluster kettle. So it seems like it's kind of breaking that principle to me, and it doesn't really fit with the rest of cluster kettle usage. So I think kubectl rollout, like if we were able to get that working the same way we have kubectl scale work with machine deployments, that would be really awesome.
Yeah, so I looked at kubectl scale. Unfortunately, it's not as simple. At least that's my take on it. There's some comments at the very bottom of the document, but it would definitely require upstream changes, possible proposals to kubectl to make this work. And I wonder if, for example, like if you look at, take something like the kubectl restart command, right, where you can pass in a deployment. If you look at the code today for kubectl, it actually has like a switch statement based on the deployment type, right? In order to really follow that same model with kubectl, you would have to have machine deployments getting pulled into the kubectl code base potentially. And I'm not sure how open they would be to that. I've never really worked with that community. But it's my point being that it's with scale, it was really nice because the abstraction they provided was really nice. That anyone could, with their CRDs could incorporate that. Unfortunately, that's not how the kubectl rollout code is structured today. So it would require some upstream in kubectl changes at that level to make it more flexible to, various resource types that people declare.
Thank you. Jason?
Well, I was just going to say, if we are worried about overloading the cluster cuddle command, we could potentially look at, a more tightly scoped like kubectl plugin that would specifically implement this feature, and that might be another potential route.
Yeah, that would be, if you have any pointers, I can message you on Slack. If you have any pointers on what you mean by a plugin for kubectl, I can definitely look at that as well.
Yep, sounds good. We can take that conversation offline.
Sure. And not to digress or anything, but is there a hard requirement that cluster kettle should not do day 2 operations? Or is that something that we eventually will gravitate towards anyways? But that might be a very long discussion.
I think in the past, we have not discussed this directly. The reason to prefer cluster cuddle plugins versus put everything in, kubectl plugins instead of cluster cuddle is generally to kind of integrate better with the larger community, because then it's right there, the functionality. You can just use it with a tool that you already know how to use for folks that are already using kubectl and they're familiar with it. David?
So kind of parlay off that. So has that been a discussion item? kubectl seems like it would be a really nice landing spot for these cluster COI kind of operations.
Not that I know of, if the question is directed at me.
More to the general group. Is it? I mean, having a one-off command line is all fine and well and good. Having that one kind of anchor point for the community does seem to have its advantages as well.
So it seems like we kind of like need to have like a larger discussion on like what we define as the 0, day 1, and day 2 operations and where they should live in the long term. I'm honestly like fine like experimenting with cluster cuddle. It's probably the quickest way to achieve something and try it out. Although if there are like concerns that then we kind of like have a precedent and we keep doing this, then we might alienate like cluster API with the rest of the community. So we have to be mindful of that as well. So I would suggest to maybe let's open a different issue and in cluster API, and then we kind of can agree on it or disagree, etc. And we can discuss about the long-term goals for cluster cuddle. As we approach beta and have more alphas, we will definitely like keep this in mind. And yeah, as Jason mentioned, like cluster cuddle could be a kubectl plugin in the long term, but we need to make that happen. We need to make sure that we're also kind of in a schedule with Kubernetes releases. So there is a lot of other stuff to think about there. So any other comment before we move off? In terms of this proposal, I'm not opposed to say like we can do the minimum necessary to kind of like see this through, with the caveat that like if this grows too much, we'll have to revisit and pull the code out and like put it somewhere else. But we're in alpha phase, so we should experiment whenever we can. And then can someone take the action item to open a different issue regarding the kubectl plugin? Because that probably needs a little bit more investigation as well. Any volunteers?
I can do it.
Who's gonna do it?
I can do it. I guess. Yeah, I can, and link it to this one.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good.
Like CDL plugin as an alternative to this particular approach, or just like in general.
I think it's more general. Like as Jason mentioned, like we should probably like see if longer term, talking like probably 6+ years, months, we should try to see if like, well, I don't know how many alpha we're gonna have. We should try to see if like cluster cuddle can become a kubectl plugin. Jason, given that you kind of brought this up, kind of lean on you to put more into writing, I guess.
Yeah, actually, yeah. In that case, I'll step back. Somebody else can do it.
Yeah, I can go ahead. I can go ahead and take the action item on that issue and start putting down some thoughts.
Sounds good. Awesome. Any other comment before we move on? All right, Cecile, take it away.
Thanks. I just wanted to bring up this that we said we would talk about at the office hours from a Slack conversation we had. Basically, right now the CAPI book is based on the master branch of the repo, and sometimes that's confusing to users because something will get merged and the documentation will get updated, but the actual feature or thing that is documented isn't available yet because it hasn't been released. So we had that happen with cluster cuddle, the get command, get kubeconfig that wasn't in the latest release, but it was in the book documented as being available as a feature. So I think we brought up potentially like having the book be based on the release branch instead. I'm not 100% sure that I'm kind of split, because I think at the same time having it based on master allows us to have more flexibility in terms of like documenting things and not having to wait for a release to fix like documentation bugs, or even like sometimes we'll have something that's changing on the infrastructure provider side and has to like change the quick start. I've had that happen a few times. And because the CAPI release usually happens before the infrastructure release, we have to wait for the CAPI release, then release the infrastructure provider, and then update the book so that it's accurate. So having it based on a release branch would mean we'd have to update the book preventatively and before the thing is actually released. But I guess we have the same problem now with CAPI. So does anyone have thoughts on that?
I do, but if someone wants to chime in, please do. All right, so when we were working on Alpha 3, the book was actually based off release 02 branch. So we would kind of, to update it, we kind of like merge PRs or backport things in from the main branch back to the release 02 branch. We could do the same. It's a matter of like then fast forwarding. So if the main branch is kind of like the same as the release branch, we could keep working on the main branch and then backport stuff when we're ready. We could just fast forward the release branch and then cut the release there. This would be fine, and we'll probably cover this exact use case where like we merge something, but we're not ready to release yet, and we don't want to merge those changes or show those changes. That said, like it wouldn't work in the case where like we have the main branch in Alpha 4, and then the release 03 is fixed, because if we have to backport fixes that include documentation, we can only PR against that branch. So while there is like the window that like the main branch and the release branch are like out of sync, we still have that problem, but it's probably like much less of an issue in that case. I'm not sure if I confused more, or hopefully that was clear. Ben?
Just occurred to me.
Go ahead.
That maybe the solution is to, well, and it's possibly actually the more complicated solution, but it's like have documentation for multiple versions at the same time, so that we can, have master or like the unreleased version documented for people who want to be on edge, and to make the job easier. But then that does require a more complicated workflow.
So on this, we actually already do this today. Like we have so if I go here, we have the legacy docs on the release 02 branch. And I don't know if this actually works. We don't have the release 03, never mind. But there's also Alpha 1 as well, which is like the really old doc. So we're already doing this in a way or another. So having a release branch and maintaining it over time, it's just more work for the maintainers. I'll be kind of straightforward. I'm fine with that if like we can share the responsibilities to kind of backport and release. That's probably fine. Fast forwarding a branch, it's not a big deal. So we can make that a policy.
Are you talking about having a release branch specifically for the book, or using the same release branch that we're using for releases?
The same release branch that we use for releases.
Okay, because it might make sense to have a book branch that is usually synced with the release branch, but then if we want to cherry pick something in there, that, you know, there's like a documentation bug and we don't want to like release just for that, then we're able to backport it there.
We could. It's a lot of more maintenance. So I don't know off the top of my head like if yeah. The other thing is like other projects I have done this in the past. KubeBuilder has done this in the past, and now they kind of like do what we do today. Because maintaining a different branch, you also have to maintain the owner's files like everywhere, and it's a long-lived branch alongside the main branch. Yeah. Anyway.
Another option is we could just add a disclaimer at the top of the main page of the book saying this documentation is based on the latest version of the code and might not be available. Like check the release notes for something.
Yeah, we could do that as well. Nadir?
Yeah, I almost want to invert it. So I do think having release 03 branch would fix the majority of the issues in that we fast forward. It does put an onus on us to produce docs that go along with the release, which is possibly not even a bad thing. And then have a subdomain that goes to the head, so that goes to the main branch, so like latest.cluster API. And I've seen that model used for lots of other projects as well. So.
Yeah, we could do that. And Andy?
Wouldn't we still have the same problem with the release branch if we are cherry picking or fast forwarding things there that aren't in a tag yet that's been actually released to GitHub? So take the cluster get kubeconfig example, and let's pretend that the main branch is for v1 alpha 4, and that's where that commit goes. And we have a release 03 branch. Like as soon as that gets picked to that branch, the book will get updated, but we haven't released it yet.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to capture before. It's like this would solve the problem when the main branch and the release branch are kind of like on the same track. But in that case, like it wouldn't solve that problem. But that's a much less problem in that case, I guess, because if we're backporting something and we have a bunch of bug fixes, we should probably release right away.
Yeah, and as we're attempting to state, it would not be features getting backported.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
So it seems like we can probably solve 90% of the issues by having release branches going forward all the time and then fast forwarding them when we're ready to make a release. Happy to do that. That's yeah, very straightforward. Cool. In terms of policy change, we should probably document this. I can take that action item unless Cecilia you want to.
Up to you. I can help if needed.
Sounds good. I probably won't have time until next week, but yeah, let's definitely work together on the policy change and yeah, document it. Cool. Any other question on the docs? All right, Cecile, go ahead.
Thanks. I wrote this down, but I think this is more for Warren if he's around. But this is a discussion that came out of his PR on checking the cluster kettle version. Basically, the question is, as we get near to v1 alpha 4, and we'll think about releasing a v04 version of cluster kettle, should that be compatible with 03x versions of cluster API? And how do we see cluster kettle version support going forward in terms of like with cluster API releases?
Yeah, so I think for that specific PR, I took the suggestion where cluster kettle will just report within the minor version. So if you have 038, it'll tell you that 039 is available. Regarding the actual stance on version for cluster kettle, I think that's a it's a good point, and it's a larger discussion. I don't know what we want to support moving forward, but it seems like there were like discussions on that thread regarding it. So yeah, I'm happy with whatever. Like, I'm happy to discuss more with the community to see what the expectations are for cluster cuddle as a CLI versus because if we even do this management cluster operator, then the CLI would have to be compatible with that operator as well. So I think there's a lot more discussion that would be required for that. Does that help?
Fabrizio? Yes.
My take on this problem is that it really depends by the velocity that we do expect that cluster cutoff will change in the future, because as we extend the compatibility, the SKU that we support, basically we are reducing the compatibility. So in my opinion, now cluster cutoff is still changing or settling down, and so we should not extend too much the compatibility range.
You? Any other comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the three options that we need to choose from are either one, say we're always going to support every version of Cluster API with any version of Cluster Kettle and have tests to make sure that that's true and we're back compatible. To say you should use like the same minor version and document that, but not like strictly enforce it. So if you're using two different versions, then we won't like we won't just like return error, but it's not recommended that you do that. Or third option is be even more restrictive and have like an actual check in place to make sure you never use two different minor versions. And if you try to do that, then we fail you and say you should use a different version of Cluster Kettle.
So you're saying like just to make a scenario example, like is like the version that you have installed of your providers are on 03x and then you're using CLI on 04 or vice versa.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, what Nadia wrote, he summarized it well. Like basically, should we strict block? Should we just recommend, or should we support back compat, forward compat every way? And we don't have to decide that now, but that's something we should think about as we're approaching, a 0.4 version.
I would say we should probably block them because we could get in really weird scenarios that can be unsupported. And our goal should not be to kind of break things, I guess. Like, but if we have to support the full thing, like that could impact even the cluster header operator work or management cluster operator. Andrew?
So just to clarify, I mean, might we want, the first release or two of V1 Alpha 4 cluster cuddle to know how to upgrade from an 0.3 to an 0.4? Because this has really bitten us before with the two like major versions of cluster cuddle, is having the existing clusters like basically not be manageable by the newer version of cluster cuddle, but the newer version is not manageable by the older version of cluster cuddle. So you end up in a weird place there.
So I think this in particular is like to use different binaries skewing at different versions. Upgrades should still work. And that's how you have had your answer.
I was just going to say upgrade must work.
Yeah.
And echo what you said, that we don't want people using 0.3 to init a 0.4 and vice versa. You wouldn't use 0.4 to init 0.3, but upgrades most definitely must work. I also, I don't know if we covered this, that so the change to the format of the variables to use the bash style substitution in the templates that broke older 0.3 cluster cuddles with newer 0.3 templates. I think that situation should be something that we strive to avoid within a minor release series of cluster cuddle. So for all 0.3, ideally, and we may want to consider a breakage like that a significant enough regression that we need to issue a new version of cluster cuddle that addresses the regression. We may have to take that on a case-by-case basis, but ideally going from 0.34 to 0.37, you should just be able to init clusters without having to worry about problems like that.
Warren?
Yeah, so just to clarify, when we say cluster cuddle upgrades should work, is that going to be a thing for, so if I have a V1 Alpha 3 cluster, would it be the cluster cuddle from V1 Alpha 4 that's responsible for upgrading, or capable of upgrading from a V1 Alpha 3 cluster to V1 Alpha 4? Or are we also expecting the cluster cuddle CLI of V1 Alpha 3 to perform upgrades between minor versions? I think, as I said, that it makes sense for the V1 Alpha 4 cluster cuddle, but I just want to clarify.
So I'm getting lost at this point, and we're 10 minutes 1 minute. So why don't we take this either on Slack or on an issue? I think the TLDR is like upgrade must work. You can init within a 0.3x or 0.34 series, so it has to be in the same minor version. Patch version can differ, that's fine. Upgrade must work across cluster cuddle versions. So, but you need a new cluster cuddle version to upgrade to Alpha 4, for example, and that's fine. But let's document all of this, and then we can discuss on an issue with the policy that we want to put in place. Does that sound good to everyone? All right, perfect. All right, long meeting today. So thank you all, and see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.